All right, it is 12 p.m. and so let's get started. Uh, Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Graham Peck, the Webner Distinguished Professor of Lincoln Studies in the History Department. Dr. Peck earned his bachelor's degree in history from California State University and his master's degree and PhD in American history from Northwestern University. Dr. Peck joined UIS in 2019. Dr. Peck's research focuses on antebellum Illinois, with a special emphasis on Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas. He has published articles in the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, the Journal of Illinois History, as he also has an essay in Practicing Democracy. His acclaimed book, Making an Anti-Slavery Nation, Lincoln, Douglas, and the Battle Over Freedom, was honored with the Illinois State Historical Society's Book of the Year Award. And he also was recognized as a finalist for the prestigious Gilder Lakeman Lincoln Prize. In addition to his written scholarship, Dr. Peck has co-produced 2 documentary films that explore the history and legacies of Lincoln and Douglas. He also co-directed a statewide art residency with U.S. visual arts professor Britton Youngard, culminating in the digital exhibit, Making Our History, Artists Render Lincoln's Legacies. This month, Dr. Peck is putting the finishing touches of his second book, The Selected Speeches of Stephen A. Douglas. This is the first scholarly edition of Douglas' speeches, which is under contract with the University of Illinois Press. Today, Dr. Peck will present Morris Birkbeck and the Making of Anti-Slavery Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peck.
Thank you for attending. I appreciate it, especially on such short notice and especially on such a beautiful day when you can be outside. Thank you those online as well. I look forward to taking questions at the end. Today, I want to introduce you to a man named Morris Birkbeck, who was one of the many historical figures well known in his day, but mostly forgotten now. Historians are certainly aware of him, and he'll pop up occasionally in a textbook or in articles or in books. But he's not a common name. And he was well known at the time, both for being an English radical, an English political radical, an advocate of republicanism in a society with a king and aristocrats, and also for being a scientific farmer, using Enlightenment ideas about science to improve practical farming. But he also became very well known later in his career for a series of books he wrote that were promoting not only republicanism, but emigration to America to create a utopian Republican society in, you guessed it, Illinois. And that experiment took a surprising turn when there was a pro-slavery movement in Illinois in 1822, threatening to destabilize his utopian republic that he had sacrificed everything to come and settle in. And he became one of the great penmen of the movement to basically sustain freedom, to stave off this pro-slavery movement, which was successful. So he was an important rhetorician in Illinois. So he had a very interesting life, and I want to share that life with you, with a particular focus on his ideas of anti-slavery. And he came to my attention when I was working on my sabbatical last fall, because I was interested in making a podcast series that was going to start with him, go through a series of anti-slavery figures, and end with Lincoln. But I ended up reading about Morris Birkbeck and getting so intrigued that I decided that I will make all of the podcast series on Birkbeck, which was not my initial intention. And the reason was because, as often happens with academics, I was so struck by what I was reading. He wrote a remarkable pamphlet in this rhetorical effort that was very Lincolnian, except, of course, it was pre-Lincoln. Lincoln at the time was 13 years old and was in Indiana. And yet I had read the pamphlet many, many years ago, but after years of reading Lincoln, rereading the pamphlet, suddenly these phrases were appearing to jump out at me in a different way. And what was particularly interesting to me was this idea that slavery and freedom were utterly antagonistic. The society that was free was totally contradicted by a society that had slaves. And that argument was one that Lincoln had with many other major political figures in the 1850s. Among them was Stephen A. Douglas, because Douglas says in the debates that we can continue living with this nation as the fathers made it, half slave and half free. There was no contradiction. If we just keep on going as we started, we'll all be fine. We don't need to have a massive political, hopefully not a military fight over this, which is what occurred. And of course, the Southerners thought this even more strongly than Douglas. People like Jefferson Davis, on the coattails of people like John C. Calhoun, argued that freedom depended on slavery, that in fact it was valuable to have a working class, and the most extreme people like George Fitzhugh, although they were not characteristic, even were willing to argue for a non-race-based slavery, that it could just be any lower class doing the work of the society, was a way for the people above them to be free. And so freedom and slavery were not contradictory. They were actually united. So Lincoln's argument was no, right? The country has a ideal, and that ideal is anti-slavery, even if the practice of the ideal is not what we would desire, but we need to align the practice and the ideal so that we can hopefully phase out the slavery. That was the anti-slavery position that he advocated and that the Republican Party did. So what was interesting, dialing back to Birkbeck, was this is exactly what Birkbeck is saying to people in Illinois in the 1820s. And so it made me curious, where did this idea come from? Because it certainly was not a standard idea for American revolutionaries. To us, it seems standard, the idea that slavery and freedom are antagonistic. We are the inheritors of the Republican Party and of what they accomplished. But they had to fight for that. And the revolutionaries, of course, created an idea of freedom in a society where all of the colonies had slaves without exceptions. The free states emerged after the revolution with anti-slavery movements that were predicated on the ideals of the revolution. But all of them came out of slaveholding colonies. And so, again, it couldn't be as if freedom could not coexist with slavery. The revolutionaries, some of them, most of them really, understood there was a conflict. But a conflict in ideas does not lead people to immediately change their practices. For among many reasons, as we know, the world doesn't run purely on ideas. Ideas influence the world, but there's other things that structure how the world runs. And Southerners, most notably, were not going to rip up their society, which they had the predominance of the slaves, even in the revolutionary years. They weren't going to rip up their societies for a contradiction in ideas. That was a totally different issue and something they struggled with. So this idea was an important new idea, that if there's freedom, there should not be slavery. And we need to literally squelch it out. And it helps explain why you get a civil war and why there was such a powerful struggle to eliminate slavery, not only in the United States, but throughout the Western Hemisphere, because other societies had the same problem. As the idea of freedom takes root, spreading from the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then through Latin American republics, this same problem emerges more widely in the globe. So I want to trace out Birkbeck's path to that idea. And that path takes us back not just to the American Revolution, although that is a part of the story, interestingly enough, but also to, as we'll see, to Birkbeck's English background and to his understandings of what English society and European society was all about. And that Republican vision came not only out of the American example, but out of his rejection of the European alternatives to republicanism. So let's start with his story. So he's born in 1764 in England. He's born to a Quaker family, which is really important because the Quakers in the 18th century were the ones who were driving the anti-slavery movement. It came out of their radical Protestantism and their belief in the equality of all people. So They were, of course, got their name famously because they would not quake in front of anyone except God, and so they wouldn't do things like take off their hats even in front of a king, which was totally unacceptable. So they were rejecting these ideas of hierarchy that structured European society, that ran right from Christendom down through the power of the earthly kings, and the order of society that flowed from that in a hierarchical society, not the American Revolution, but its opposite, what it rebelled against. So the Quakers were an extreme critic of this kind of idea. Now, granted, they were an extreme critic primarily spiritually, but it overflowed into the temporal world because, for instance, even women's roles, they were way in advance of most everyone else. Women were allowed to speak in Quaker meetings. This was totally atypical. That was not women's roles, and there were all sorts of reasons for that in European society, and that would be overcome only over hundreds of years. In fact, you can still find churches today. My mother was Episcopalian, switched to an evangelical church. This was only 20 years ago. And in that church only 20 years ago, women were not supposed to speak. So it's not all gone. So the Quakers were dealing with that hundreds of years ago, and their women were speaking for the same reason, because the women were equal in God's sight as God's creatures. So this made them very anti-slavery, and this did deeply influence Birkbeck, because even though he would eventually 40 years later repudiate Quakerism and become an Enlightenment rationalist, he did not repudiate many of the religious sort of ideals that had flowed out of Quakerism, and certainly not the ideal of equality. So Birkbeck was certainly wealthier than the average Englishman. And Quakers in general were tended to be wealthier than average. Often they were merchants, and merchants did quite well. So his family was not poor, and it was well connected. But they were far from being part of the aristocracy, and he himself never became a landowner, which is a very important part of his story, because only landowners could vote. There's a very small population that could vote. So the political system, he's outside of it, despite being, very intelligent, very well educated by the standards of the time, very successful, as we shall see, but nevertheless not a landowner and not a voter. So how does he end up becoming successful? Well, interestingly enough, again, this is a part of the human past that mostly we've forgotten, but he was apprenticed at the age of 13, which was a common age for being apprenticed, and he was apprenticed for 5 years to a sheep farmer. So not exactly the Oxford track to becoming a lawyer or a priest. So he works for a sheep farmer, getting his training, and then for 3 years he's independent, and he travels around England working in other farms to get more experience. And then at the age of 21, he starts his first farm, leasing it. Very important. This is important to understand. Kind of like a renter today for a home. You need to earn money to make your home payment, to stay in the home, but you don't own it, and if you don't make the payments, out you go. So a lot of land was leased like that, where you would lease a farm from a wealthy, usually aristocrat type, certainly gentry, who were the gentry and the aristocrats owned basically 95% of the land. And so you're renting from them, and you use the farm to make money, to pay the rent, and hopefully to keep whatever else is left for yourself. So theoretically, you can gain capital and become quite wealthy in this manner. It's not impossible. But you are always under the gun of needing to make the payments. Bad crops, they're a real threat to you. And so, and you still have no power, right, in the society. So he complained bitterly about this. So he lives his life for many years in England, even though he was a great admirer of American republicanism. In a curious, paradoxical sort of way, he was a child of the American Revolution, because he was born in 1964. In 1783, in the Treaty of Paris, he's 19 years old. So in his youth, he saw this great rebellion, and he saw this Republican example, and he liked it. And in fact, he was interested in coming to America very early in his life. The only reason he didn't was because he felt he needed to take care of his father in an age before old age homes and institutional care. And in fact, that would play a key role. He comes to America when his father dies, many, many years later. So he takes this path of building his fortune in America. Not a massive fortune, but a pretty healthy one by American standards, just not by aristocratic standards. And he does so by becoming a fairly acclaimed scientific farmer. So he is well known. In fact, George Washington tries to recruit him to be a farmer here, and he almost came. So he had quite a reputation, and he moved from his first leased farm to an aristocrat's farm called Wanborough, which is still there. And I'm seriously thinking of visiting there this summer. I have to see. I've got to get this book done, but that opens up. I'd like to go there because it's one of the few places that's still related to him, and he is still well known. It's got an 800-year history. It's a historic place. He was there only briefly, but he managed it in that brief time. So he'd kind of elevated to a pretty impressive degree. So he's managing a whole estate. But he's still not a landowner. He's still not a voter. And he's still complaining about it. He points out that the only time he's ever invited to a political meeting is when the aristocrats need to get the run-of-the-mill people to elevate the voices and the volume for something they want, and they're struggling against some other entity to get. Then suddenly there's an invitation, please come to this political meeting and speak up and promote this thing. But that's the only time you're ever invited. And he didn't like that. So that was his reputation until 1814, a successful, fairly well-known scientific farmer. And then he does something very interesting. He travels to France in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars in order to see what this new Republican society was like. Now, think about this for a minute. It's very interesting. This was the arch enemy of England. And it was a society that had been closed for some time. It had embargoes and various things during the Napoleonic Wars. It'd be sort of like an American goes to North Korea now. It's open. They're not going to put me in jail. I won't become a political hostage. I want to go see what's there. And I'm going to report on it and tell Americans what North Korea is like. And so he goes and does that using his wealth. He's got enough money. He can take off for a whole series of months and just tour around. And he's got his literary ability. So he's taking all these notes, and he comes back and he publishes it in 1814, Notes on a Journey Through France. And it goes berzonkers, goes through 5 editions really rapidly, and even an edition in America. Thomas Jefferson learns about him. Thomas Jefferson owns one of his books. And so he's becoming a transatlantic writer and a transatlantic radical. And what does he say that's very alarming? He says, oh, I really admire North Korean dictatorship. It's something we need to consider. That's what he says. He says, I love this republicanism. And it tells the British audience how great it is. And they've got a king and they've got an aristocrat. So it sets off a lot of intellectual fireworks because they're not really interested in hearing this. The conservatives see this as a kind of dangerous, rebel-rousing, we just had a French Revolution, if you didn't notice. Destroying order is not what we want to do. And what is republicanism? It's a society without a king and sometimes without an aristocracy. And it's a society of equal citizens. Just what was happening in America and starting to spread around the globe, and just what the conservatives in Europe are very, 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 very afraid of, and will remain afraid of for most of the 19th century. So Birkbeck, in saying this, stakes out interesting ground. He says, I wander around, and what do I see? One of the most amazing things I see are peasants who now have land, because in the land reform that followed the revolution, they take land from the king, they take land from the aristocrats, they take land, of course, from the church. So they're powerful edifice of aristocratic control from the medieval era that worked hand in hand with kingly and aristocratic power. And he says, what do I see with these peasants? They have energy. They're laborious. They have a gleam in their eye. And they've received some education. And astonishingly, he says, the women got some education. And they start doing things. The women are different, even the female peasants. It's not like England. He said, what do we say in England about the peasantry? We call them the poor. We refer to the poor. It's a synonym, he says, for the laboring class. They are one and the same. They're indistinguishable. And he says they're derelict. They're despondent. There's no hope because there is no hope. And I saw something different in France. So the irony is that he becomes the greatest convert to his own Republican vision. His father dies, crucially, and in 1817, he decides to decamp for America. Because if he thought Republicanism was the future, and he wasn't the only dreamer like this is why de Tocqueville comes over from France several decades later and writes his remarkable book, and in it predicts that this is the future, that aristocracy cannot stand against this new kind of society. And he was right. He also had some concerns about democracy. He wasn't all wrong about that either. But this same appeal for this amazing new kind of world was real. And so from Birkbeck's standpoint, he could stay like a potted plant in England and never enjoy it. Or he could make the leap. And like many immigrants, before and since, but mostly since, he imagined this as a gift to his children. He said, for me, there is great sacrifice of comfort. And there was. He was on an aristocrat's estate. You see the pictures of Wanborough. It's a nice, big place. This was not a poor man. And he had nice, genteel friends. He liked spending time with them. Had all the culture of England. It'd be like being in New York City. This was not the sticks. He was at the center of world civilization. And he gives that up, not for the East Coast, where would be the next best thing probably in the English-speaking world. No, he comes out to the unbroken prairie, still filled with beasts. Read about Lincoln and Indiana, the howls of the wolves. It's going away as the settlers come in and they plow the land and they shoot the beasts. But Illinois in 1817 wasn't there yet. And he wanted to come out where the land was cheapest, $2 an acre in 1817. He planned in his dream to buy a lot of it to create his Republican utopia. And so he's going to give up comfort, but he's hoping for the glory of being part of a Republican society and a benefit to his children. So he comes through Virginia. And he's going to walk through Virginia, get up to Philadelphia, hit Pittsburgh, and then walk primarily from Pittsburgh. I'm actually forgetting if he got on a boat at all now, however. I don't think he did. But just walked all the way. It's more common to get on a boat. They went on the road the whole way. And all the time, he's doing like de Tocqueville, studying these people. He's doing, again, what he did with his notes on a journey in France. He's going to publish them as a notes on a journey in America, from Virginia to Illinois. And it's also going to go through multiple editions very rapidly. It's also going to generate much controversy because he's going to suggest to his English readership that you need to come join me. I'm the vanguard. I'm creating the opportunity for the common laborer who does not have the money except to get on a boat. I will have our little English Republican utopia ready for you. It's sort of the beginning of, kind of an ethnic enclave. Normally, we wouldn't consider that with the Brits. We think of that as some group in Chicago, some Ukrainians in a little village or something. So that was the idea, though. We're a little bit different, but we can sort out a nice little Republican agricultural village in Illinois. And all the way through, in his journey, he's scoping out the land. What's its value? Should we stop in Ohio? So many visitors did this who went west because they're all thinking about their future. And it was a huge decision. Where do I go? Where do I buy? How will the land values appreciate? Can I get to markets? All these kind of considerations. So he decides that Illinois is the best. However, there was one great repugnant feature of America. And he was well aware before he came. It probably could be said of Birkbeck, like Lincoln, that he had always hated slavery. Lincoln says that famously. There's no reason to disbelieve him. Much reason to believe him, empirically. And with Birkbeck, he doesn't say that, but it's almost certainly true. You never find a pro-slavery word out of Birkbeck. Everything you ever hear from him is hostile to him. So he even writes before he gets off the boat in Virginia, where he starts to take his notes. He says, slavery is the foul leprosy, the blot on American republic. Leprosy is a powerful word, horrendous spreading disease that consumes the flesh and kills you. So he understood its dangers implicit in his mind. They were there before the 1822 debates. And his convictions on this point are only deepened when he steps off the boat. Because what he sees is a society of profound inequality. The same inequality he saw in England, except more intense, more debilitating, more degrading. So he sees a slave sale, and he was not unusual. He weeps when he sees it. Woman and 2 children. And he was not the only, non-slaveholder, non-Southerner to record these kind of sentiments when they saw that. There's a recollection, actually, that I read in the sources by a former Southerner who came to Illinois, played a friend of Lincoln, a leading attorney in Quincy. He went back to visit his relatives, which was quite common in the antebellum era. And he saw a slave sale, and he recorded it in his diary as deeply disturbing because he hadn't seen that for, say, 20 years. Actual making property of people and doing whatever you wanted with their lives was not something that seemed remotely appropriate or acceptable unless you were enmeshed in it and it become common practice. You'd become hardened to it. So he sees that. He also sees common violence. So many people don't know this, but lots of people who made records of the antebellum South noted that many free blacks liked to dress up very flashily. Many people who've noted that. They were free to do so if they had the money to buy the clothes, and they did. But that didn't mean that they were equal. And he saw people just vilely abuse free black people, like throwing things that are like harmful to their eyes and their clothes, just throwing it in their faces, knocking them down in the street, cursing them. And that he was astonishing to him. He said, even in England, the law protects on an equal basis the personal security and life of a lord, an entrepreneur, or the meanest, poorest person on the face of the country. The lord could not go and bash a poor person without being subject to it. So that astonished him, it seems. So it was a tale of sort of 2 republics, because he was appalled by that, and he was very glad he was leaving it as soon as possible. He saw that within 3 weeks he was out of Virginia, out of the South. On the other hand, he loved the republicanism. He loved what he saw of white society. So he said in a Virginia tavern, one of his first observations was that I saw a group of Americans in that tavern more equal than any group of Englishmen I had ever seen in my entire life. And he was in his 50s. He said, from the best dressed to the worst dressed, there was only a moderate distinction. Whereas in England, in any society that is bifurcated by class, and especially class that is rooted in law, there will be pronounced efforts to reinforce those statuses in clothing because it matters to recognition of role and legal rights at all times. You'll find this in many societies. In fact, many of those societies will actually limit what can be worn so that it can't be a confusion of role. So he notices this. He also notices the same kind of energy and independence and equality that he had started to see in France. And this was interesting to him because he had all the ideas of English status in his head. He's sort of an interesting creature because his utopian ideals were much like Jefferson's. Jefferson had wonderful ideals. It was hard to realize them for Jefferson. And not just Jefferson, as I suggested, for lots of people. But Birkbeck was the same way because he was really a wealthy guy and he lived in the status-oriented society his whole life. And so just immediately he put people into categories, kind of like we do with education. Oh, you went to Harvard. Oh, that's right? We have that same thing with education, but they had that with whole classes of people. So on his boat that dropped him off in Virginia, he said, the boat captain was such an extraordinary individual. He seemed so respectable, a word that we don't use anymore. It divvied up those who were genteel from those who weren't in England. And then he was shocked because he realized, wait, they're all respectable. He met someone who dealt with customs, and there was only one of him. And the fact there was one was astonishing. In England, there were three because they stole. And so there was three to keep tabs on one another so they didn't steal from the state and the people because the government was corrupt. And he finds one intelligent, again, respectable American doing this job. And it leapt off the page for him. And he sees this again and again and again and again. So he writes of these things in his book. And when he gets to the end of his journey, he hasn't lost his idealism at all. He does not want to live in the South, but he believes Illinois is separate from the South. It's walled off by the Northwest Ordinance. It's free. And so as long as you move to the free society, you're okay. And he ends his book saying, Englishmen, come. What I've learned is that this will be easier than I believed. It didn't actually prove to be so, but he encouraged them to come. And he set aside his money, and he had a partner, actually, I'm not going to speak much about, but his partner, they bought 20,000 acres. Not poor. So they bought an enormous patch of land that he was planning to create his new Republican society in which he would be like the aristocratic English gentleman. His dream that he would have all these English laborers around him. So it's very ironic. He would make it easy for him to come because he would own the land. And then he wanted to sell it to them, but they could sell it and buy it in little small plots, but not according to what happened in American history, where the farmers keep going west, keep turning that free land from the Indians into capital, and they keep sort of pushing the frontier. No, that actually was not what he imagined, right? He was imagining an English village with the head of the manor, and they would all be happy around him, and they'd create a market society. It was a very different vision, really, than the American frontier, but he saw the prospects for it. So all of this, of course, was very difficult for his children because he pulled them across the shore with them, and his not so egalitarian ideals towards women were actually very apparent at one very interesting moment. His father finds a political foe in some mailroom or something. I can't remember exactly where it was, but he's with his daughter. And this is one of these conservatives who thinks he's nuts for going to America. It's all crazy. And the father says, the other gentleman says to the daughter, so your father is going to be like taking you on this, crazy journey and ruining your life. And, what do you think about that? And Birkbeck, and he writes this in his book. And I immediately said, my daughter will, of course, dutifully do what her father desires. That's pretty interesting. So, and she did. And so all 5 children come, 3 sons and 2 daughters. And one of the daughters writes back, we have some correspondence. I wish we had more. We have some correspondence because he had a beloved friend in England and he kept corresponding with him. And the beloved friend thought he was out of his mind too. It's like, there was some clear-headed thinking versus utopian thinking. No, you're actually rich. You're in a highly civilized society and you're living really well. You've got in your mind that this is a terrible place to be, which he did. I forgot to mention this. So he perceived a just giant cavern between the aristocracy and the poor. And he said, my position is really not much different than being poor. because I've always got the worry of paying my rent. And so he wasn't entirely wrong, but it was sort of like stretching the reality, I think, a little bit. And his best buddy was like, "You're out of your mind. This isn't so bad here." And so they wrote back and forth. And in fact, in one of the letters, he writes about how his daughter is appalled at society in Frontier, Illinois. She says, "I will never get accustomed to the slatternly dress and the complete lack of respectability of every female that is west of like Richmond." And she said that was it. Society ended there, which of course was not an atypical idea among Americans. The same sort of frontier concern was frequently expressed in the East, but it wasn't entirely wrong. There was abundance of only one thing where they were, and that was rattlesnakes. There was enormous numbers of them everywhere. So Birkbeck is planning to enjoy his utopia. He says, "In the quietude of my life, my son's going to run the estate. I'm going to read and do Jeffersonian-like things where everyone will be working around me and I'll be an intellectual." And then, of course, the pro-slavery bomb explodes. And it exploded because of geography and greed. So Illinois is settled from the south, and the south is on the Ohio River. And a lot of Southerners are on the Ohio River just across it. And so it was very easy for them to get in a boat, sail down, hop off in southern Illinois, and move northward. And that's how Illinois was initially settled. And of course, these Southerners bring slaves, or I should say the wealthy ones bring slaves. It was actually a distinct minority of them because, first of all, it was a minority of Southerners owned slaves. But the wealthy Southerners, would almost always own slaves. It'd be kind of rare to be wealthy Southerners and not own slaves. So the political class that comes over has slaves, and they basically work around the Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited that, and created an indenture system where slaves would sign with an X that legally I agree to be your servant for 99 years, meaning forever. And this was not really legal, but they were a long, long way away from Washington, D.C., and they got away with it. But the problem was in 1818, when Illinois becomes a state, the pro-slavery politicians probably had a majority in the state, in the Illinois State Convention, Constitutional Convention, but they were afraid of sending up a pro-slavery constitution to Congress because Congress had to accept it. And they had to balance their desire for in a perfect world we could have slavery with we want to be a state, and statehood's going to come with all sorts of goodies like senatorships and governorships and things we want as the political class. So they were fairly confident that they tried to be a slave state out of the Northwest Ordinance, they'd really be asking for it. They wouldn't get their way. So they basically camouflaged the indentured servitude as much as they could. They basically made that legal forever. If you were an indentured servant, okay, you're going to have to remain an indentured servant. And we can make indentured servants for a small number of cases in a certain place in the Salines for a few more years, but after that, it'll go away. So they're basically telling the Congress, we're mostly in accord with the Northwest Ordinance, but we want to keep the slaves that we have. This produced some debate in Congress. The anti-slavery people were not happy, but it goes through. So Illinois is essentially going to become a free state, but it's going to take a little while before it's totally free, decades, literally. And so there were a group of the pro-slavery side, and we actually do not know much about the story at all, mostly because most of the documentation got destroyed in two great fires, one the Chicago fire, where the Chicago Historical Society had been created and had a lot of documents and it burned in the fire. And then also in the 1840s, a guy named Senator Breese decided to write a 2-volume history of Illinois, which he did. He asked everyone across the state to send him their correspondence, which they did, and his house burned down. So we lost most of the records from early Illinois. We don't really know a lot about the pro-slavery movement, but fairly certain that what was going on was the pro-slavery faction had this sneaky idea that, hey, we're now a state, Congress can't get in the way. If we change our state constitution and make it a slave state, it's now out of their hands. So they moved to create a constitutional convention in 1822, and through very anti-democratic means, they managed to thrust it through the state assembly. They had every vote they needed but one, so they did all sorts of gyrations to get that one vote by doing all sorts of illegal things, but they got the vote. and they put this convention into the political maelstrom that would follow. And it divided the state profoundly because even though the state was mostly Southerners, the Southerners who really wanted slavery could easily go to Alabama, Mississippi. So the ones who picked Northwest Ordinance in Illinois were ones who were usually very anti-Black, but also anti-slavery. It was a common combination. And so they weren't necessarily eager for slavery to be engrafted on the state. And also it so happened that there was a big depression at the time, and slaveholders had money. And so there was an economic argument: we legalize slavery, more money will come into the state. So there were these efforts to kind of convince people that economically they'd be better off if they embraced slavery, but another whole portion of the population was hostile to this. And Birkbeck takes up his pen. He now believes he has to take on the duties of citizenship. So if Republican equality meant that you governed yourselves, you can't just sit on your city on the hill when the Republic needs you. So he steps up and does a lot. He, along with Governor Edward Coles, who was a former slaveholder who famously freed his slaves on the Ohio River, coming down to Illinois because he was one of the slaveholders who was so convicted by American republicanism, he emancipated his slaves. There were a bunch of people like this. There were thousands of slaves freed by masters, not by the states, freed by masters in the South that created a lot of the free black population after the Revolution. He was one of these people, except he also took his slaves out of the state and brought them to Illinois. So he was the leading, probably if you had to pick one guy, he was the leading figure in the what was called the anti-convention movement. People who wanted to defeat this convention. Oh, I should mention one thing. Under the Constitution, the convention had to be ratified by the people after the assembly approved it, or the legislature approved it. There had to be 18-month waiting period. Then there'd be a vote, and the people would ratify the convention, in which case they would hold a new constitutional convention. But if it was defeated, no constitutional convention. So that's why there was a political maelstrom. There was 18 months of debate over whether to hold this convention. And so Birkbeck, along with Coles, is one of the premier rhetoricians. And he ends up writing not only a whole series of newspaper editorials using a pen name called Jonathan Freeman, and he was a very gifted writer. So this was not high, elegant prose. This was, he pretended to be a guy named Jonathan Freeman, and he wrote as if I'm an American, and why would I want slavery, and all these terrible things are going to happen. So he wrote a whole series of those. And then he also wrote some things under his own name. And he also wrote this remarkable pamphlet called An Appeal to the People of Illinois. And he does this in his own name, and he actually talks about writing from his estate, which he called Wanborough, after the aristocratic estate he'd been on. And it's worthwhile looking at some of the language that he has in relationship between republicanism and slavery, because we get a sense of this anti-slavery freedom, what I call an anti-slavery freedom, a freedom that rejects slavery. He says the happy and most honorable condition of mankind was equal freedom and protection. That was the first rank of human society. This is the utopian dream he had. But he said the last and meanest rank is that of master and slave. Freedom had to be universal. He said it is the right to do everything but injury and the enjoyment of protection from being injured. So strike out all these rules and statuses and things that keep people down. Let them go do what they want to do. Make something of themselves. But they can't injure people. That's the rule. The oppression of anyone endangered everyone. No one was safe if you made exceptions to this rule of equality. What security remains for you or for me, he asked his fellow Illinoisans, if we, in future, chance to be in the minority? The state, he pointed out, had prohibited slavery. So if we legalize it, if we choose to legalize it, we destroy the presumption that every inhabitant is free by right, derived by a power paramount to all majorities. Right? This is totally Madisonian. Terrified of the dangers that pure, untrammeled majority rule would pose to liberty. The majority untrammeled is no different than any other terrible dictator. The same squashing of security that freedom and equality provide. Birkbeck says this freedom by right is, quote, the basis of our social compact in Illinois. But what was of concern to him was more than Illinois. It was the entire American Republican experiment. He wrote that, quote, in a nation composed of free whites and Negro slaves, society, if it may even be called such, is in a most deplorable condition. There is no social fellowship, no intermarriage, and no common sympathy. All of these were essential to the Republican society of equals, who would seek to govern themselves rather than be governed by someone else. Or you'd be in small communities, you would know each other, and you would seek the common good. But that couldn't exist if you've got a group of people who are aliens to it, who have no reason to contribute to the common good, who have every reason to steal, right? To commit any kind of crime that allows them to survive, that makes their circumstances better because you've condemned them to the outer darkness. So you've now created a massive conflict within your society by creating a caste. If we do that, he says, it is not a republic. It is a confederacy of tyrants, pure aristocratical despotism. On that note, we'll leave Morris Birkbeck.
So what happened to 20,000 acres?
Oh, well, they were created, right? So you ended up, so his partner and he, it's kind of an interesting story in and of itself, ended up having a fight basically on the way to Illinois, which had huge implications for what would be called the English settlement. And so that's why it was called that, because it was these English people who made the settlement. So they had expected to have one unified settlement, but it was actually a fight over a woman, because I didn't mention this, but Birkbeck's wife died after they had 7 children. And it was 5 children. 5 came with him. Maybe there were 7. Forgetting, sorry. But in any case, he had a lot of children. Most of them come with him, not all. And there was this lovely young lady who also came with them. She was much younger than him. And his buddy was also much younger than him. It was the same guy, actually, who went with him in France. So he was very good friends with this guy. So it was a very sad falling out. And essentially what happens is, in the middle of this journey, they announced that they're getting married. And he did not take it very well. He was very, very put out by this because he wanted to marry her. And so they end up essentially establishing separate communities. And what would have happened with those communities is not quite clear. Wanborough is the one that's disappeared. The other one is still there, so you can still go visit the town. Wanborough ends up just sort of disappearing from the earth because of sort of a sad coda to his story, despite his great contributions to Illinois history. And I think they really were quite impressive because it was a crucial moment in Illinois history. And the vote was won by the anti-slavery side, by the way, but not by a vast margin. And the 18 months was critical. If it hadn't been for the 18 months, they'd have lost the vote, because I actually documented this in my book, which no one had figured out before, but there was a large increase in migrants into Illinois, and I was able to kind of prove that by sort of voting records. And I also found a census that had been lost. And it's almost guaranteed that all those people, there was an overwhelming influx of anti-slavery settlers. So he was doing the rhetoric, or the rhetoric would have worked if you didn't have anti-slavery settlers who liked the rhetoric. Hard to know, right? But so he plays this key role. He briefly gets put actually into the position of Secretary of State by Edward Coles, but he's bounced from that because, kind of like today, the Senate had to approve this, and Edward Coles' enemies were in the Senate. A lot of pro-slavery folks were really unhappy about all this. So they booted Birkbeck out. And so he leaves that job after a brief time, and he ends up visiting New Harmony in Indiana, another utopian settlement. And as a reminder, like he literally paid with his life for his utopianism, because he comes back to cross the Wabash River, which is a pretty big river, to get back to Illinois when he was done with his visit. And the ferry boat that had taken him there across the river was not there. And so he and his son decided not to go back to New Harmony and safely, and come back again a day later. This is the reality of a world before internal improvements. Bridges are a very valuable thing. We don't think about them because they're everywhere. You don't have a bridge, rivers are really hard to get across, and they're dangerous. And so he and his son decided to swim their horses across. And that was the last decision he ever made. He did not make it. The horse went under. He drowned. He came up once for air. His son tried to save him, but his son had actually another common thing. Sicknesses were incredibly routine in the West. There was tons and tons. They didn't know it. The worst single one was probably malaria, all these mosquitoes in swampland. And I know what mosquitoes were doing. They thought it was bad air, the bad smells from they smelled the bad smells from the decaying stuff in the swamp. And they're like, it's the bad smells. Oh, like all the mosquitoes that were coming out of the swamp and biting you. So anyway, all these people, like it was routine for huge numbers of people to migrate and die. And if you didn't die, you had the shakes, which was miserable, and you survived it and then got on with your life. Made it through that first year or two. It's called the seasoning. So anyway, his son had just got over this, survived. It was very weak, could not pick up his father, get him across the Wabash River. He had to let him go, and barely made it himself to the bank, in which he just said he laid there for a long time. Of course, as you would if you virtually died, right? So then they found his father a few days later. So that was the sad end of the story, which in a sense got sadder because they didn't even stay in Illinois and make a working concern of this. And they built a beautiful house. He had a beautiful house. So yeah, he had the money to do it. The sons end up going to Mexico to be miners, kind of like mining is always like that. It's like dig money from the ground. So that's an appealing prospect to people. So they went to Mexico to mine. That didn't work out after a few years. And it didn't work out great for his daughters. Some of them died. They married, one of them married a ne'er-do-well, in the English settlements. That wasn't great. And then I don't think all of them were still living, but 3 or 4 of them end up going to Australia. And one of the really interesting things I found out, and amazing, there's another historic site where his descendants are in Australia. I could visit that too, although I'm not going to. It cost me a fortune. And he was never there, right? But you can go get married at the Birkbeck place in Australia. Doesn't look as nice as Warnboro, but still sort of like one of these early places in Australian history. So different than Warnboro, but it's got a spot and map. And when I gave this talk at the American Historical Association, and a colleague of mine who I know pretty well was very excited I was doing this because he knows a lot about early Illinois. So he was excited that I was doing stuff on Birkbeck. And he said, by the way, you probably don't know this. And I didn't. He's like, there's a collection of Birkbeck's manuscript in Australia. The Birkbeck family papers. Like, you kidding me? I was like, have they ever been used by anyone? It's like, I don't think so. So I haven't looked into it yet. I don't know how much in this day and age, usually you can do a lot even from afar, right? You figure it out. Hey, nothing else, pay someone to go on them. So who knows? I mean, I'm not getting my hopes up because that's dangerous as historians. That's what you do. You go through these things and often you don't find anything, right? But there could be stuff on, say, the anti-slavery struggle, which would be fascinating if there's some correspondence that he has, because he was a big player in that. He was corresponding with people. That would be amazing if there's some letters in Australia on this, I'd be cool.
Can you, I know it's kind of running, briefly talk a little bit about, and I have some idea, but I'd like to hear your explanation of the anti-slavery and anti-Black.
Okay, so basically the racism that existed in 19th century America was massively more intense than anything we can imagine today. And so it was an element of the anti-slavery movement, with the exception of people like Quakers. Okay, so Quakers there was different kinds of anti-slavery people, is the best way of saying this. They were all opposed to slavery. They're mostly also fairly opposed to slaveholders by and large, although that intensified over time. As slaveholders started to threaten white rights, that became, a major staple of anti-slavery discourse as well. But and most of them were more or less sympathetic to Black people compared to other whites. Okay, so nothing like today, though. None of these people were 20th century liberals. Even the most liberal you can find, a New England abolitionists, in their own records. And it's like one of them, like, had the story of a free black guy who he was sort of like becoming, friends is the wrong word, but like associate with, learning about his life because these people were segregated in the North very extensively. So he's integrated with him a little bit because of the anti-slavery movement. But the guy like hooks up his arm with him and starts walking down the street. And the white guy's like horrified beyond belief, just like deeply, deeply unhappy that this has happened, trying to figure out how to deal with it. Like that's the mental world we're in. And that's the most egalitarian person we're talking about. So were there a few people that were like maybe John Brown, that were sort of like described as like having hearts of black men? Yeah, maybe a couple, but even most are abolitionists. They do not want like a black person marrying their daughter. Okay, so we have to like get in that world. That's the word we're talking about. And so the folks that are coming out of the South, definitely not in that world. These are not New England abolitionists. So they're people who are in a society where it's been, the racial idea has been essential to subordinate a caste. And they're bound up in it because there's all these rules like slave patrols, where these are the kind of people that are maintaining the order, the racial order and the labor order, and effectively the political order, keeping the peace, right? And it's just like Birkbeck's talking about. It's basically managing sort of an enemy in your midst, which is what Jefferson, talked about and was worried about. They were all worried about that. They were all worried about slaves killing people, right? So they had this language of slaves aren't happy, they won't do that, blah, 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 blah. But then you'll find another letter 2 days later, we're worried about them killing us, kind of thing. And if anything ever happened, it'll be all over the papers, they freak out, right? If there's some threat or something happens. So all this is very common in the history of the South. So part of the reason these people are anti-slavery and anti-black is that they want to get out of that world. They're like Birkbeck, they don't like it. Do you want to have to go to slave patrol? You want to have to like worry about the slaves cutting your throat? You want to have to worry about the slaves raping your wife? You want to have to yourself like be beating the slaves potentially, because beating people is violent. Some people like that. A lot of people also realize that if you're violent to someone, they might be violent to you, right? It's hard to use violence and not be like aware that maybe it's me next time, right? That works going to be different. I'll be alone on the road. 3 slaves will hop out and take care of me, right? So they didn't like that world, and so there was hopefully a white world that they could join, which also had, in addition to that, it wasn't just the racial thing, economic opportunity, because the slave owners had more money, just like today. Why is New York, London real estate expensive? Well, it's because people who want that the most will pay a lot for it. Typically, it's people in finance in these major world cities now. It's not like Toyota. They're off in some suburb in Japan or somewhere else because they need a lot of land. But the people who want the interaction with other elites is often finance or very high level, you want super expensive housing, you want a nice place to show off your super wealth, those kind of people. They'll bid it way up. Well, the same thing happens with farmland in the South. It's no different. So if you want the good farmland because you've got slaves and you're trying to make a cash crop, you bid that land up and you buy out all the poor people. So the poor people in the South, they're always living in the bad farms. They're in the piney woods of Texas. They're in the Appalachian Mountains, right? And the ones that live with the slaveholders, then they're sort of kind of a subordinate class, and they don't like necessarily hate the slaveholders. They kind of work with them, but they're aware of their subordination. And if you want a greater level of equality, go to Illinois, right? And you can get out of that, hopefully, and you can have your own place and have more hopes for yourself and your kids. So there was economic motives, there were racial motives, and yet it was also bound up in kind of a hostility to blacks because blacks were the enemy, right? It was like think of it this way: in modern segregation, it's been a lot of whites and sometimes other people too, but leaving white communities when blacks come in. And what's the language of all that? If you read like the 1950s, they're terrified of basically A, integration, B, losing their jobs if their jobs were around like an industry, and C, they're terribly worried about the economic collapse of the pricing of their home and of crime. They basically think the areas are going to decline in value. So these 3 reasons, they all leave. So there's sort of a similar logic here where it's like, we're stuck in this world where we're with a group of people that are by de facto criminals, right? And which was true because the slaveholders knew. The slaveholders hated the fact that like a barn would burn down, plow would get broken, pigs would get eaten, right? Molasses would get stolen. Why? Well, because you weren't feeding that much, and they're like, they wanted it, they're hungry, and they wanted a treat, right? So if they could do that secretly, they would. So historians of slavery call that basically sort of rebellion without a rebellion, right? It's lower tier resistance, they call it. That's how they resisted slavery. The other side of it is they're taking all this stuff, right? So if you have a whole habit of that, well, then that's happening in the whole society. So these white people wanted to get out of that entire environment too. And this was well known and extensively discussed. Even Birkbeck finds this, right? They're talking about this in taverns. So they know the world they're in, these white people. And, the question was, what do you do about it? So this was Jefferson's problem. He didn't think it was good, but Jefferson feared a society of integration, right? If he could have imagined integration, it's a different story, but he couldn't. So if you got a third of your population is a slave population that you don't believe can be integrated into a republic, you've got a big problem. That's when you're looking for colonization, right? And that's where if you can't find the colonization, you're like, we can't let them go. So that's why he has his famous analogy that we've got the wolf by the ears. That's exactly what he's saying. It will bite us. And they were even more worried. By here, here's another. So it's one thing. Resistance is one thing. They were very worried, all of them, all the way down to secession. The Southern political leaders are terrified of a race war if the blacks are free, which didn't actually. It was one of these funny things. History shows us all the time. There's so much paradox and contradiction and unexpected, outcomes in history. This is one of their great fears, and of course, it didn't happen in Reconstruction, right? Black people didn't go on a rampage and start killing white people, but they were afraid this would happen. Yeah, they predict race wars in the 1850s.
That makes sense. And I guess in my head, I'm trying to. So I'm a psychologist. Just part of the problem. So I'm thinking, well, the slavery thing. This is awful. This is horrible. I'm not cool with that. But the people that are being enslaved, I don't really like them either. And so in my head, what I'm trying to do is.
You mean like what I'm saying about stealing and stuff?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. So what's in that midpoint, right? So do you understand what I'm saying? It's like this is a terrible thing, but the people that they're doing it to, I don't like them, and so I'm trying to figure out what's in that mid space, and we're not going to be able to do that. But
well, this is why Birkbeck wanted a space where people were equal. I mean, that's why he loved the idea of equality, even though he wasn't a perfect practitioner of it. Yeah. But he loved the idea of it because he saw the consequences of it in Europe with all, and he wasn't wrong. I mean, essentially, like peasants were not dissimilar to slaves. That's why there's been comparative studies of serfs and slaves, because serfdom was in many ways very similar. It was not identical. And peasants, not all peasants were serfs, but all those peasants all over the world, right? I mean, basically the history of most of kind of modern word's wrong word, kind of like once you go from humans, like write about this kind of history, so I don't have the proper language, but once you go from humans basically migrating around and hunting things, they settle down and create agricultural societies. Okay, so this is a huge significance. I never studied this, really talking about in classes, but it's an enormous significance historically, because that's when you start getting a lot more sophistication in human societies. You start getting more food, so you can build urban areas, you get more trade, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of interesting things happen once that happens. And yet, of course, that's also the time when you get a hierarchy. You get people that own the land and force other people to work for them. So you go from a world where people sort of shared, where there's a lot of sharing because humans need to share to sort of survive, in this very different world, like you break a finger, like, trying to fight the buffalo, and you want the other humans to help support you while your hand's healing. Like that happened in human history. We have records of it, but that had to have happened. If that person was valuable, you wait till their hand heals and you keep feeding them stuff like that. Well, they can't do anything. And yet slavery is just sort of, as I call it, kind of a cousin to sharing. It's where some humans are like, yeah, we share together, we're working together, but I got this nice abstract idea. We're going to keep doing all the work together except me. They're going to work and they're going to give it to me. And how can I work that out? I just need to force them to do it. And that all makes logical sense. It's not that hard to imagine that or do it, because, of course, there were always people who were violent. Right? There were always people who were leading the clan, like the guy who leads the wolf and keeps the other wolves in subjection. He runs the thing. Men were the same way, right? So it's kind of the origins of patriarchy. He's the biggest guy, biggest club. The other men do what he says. Then you got all the men doing what he says, and everyone else doing what they says. Pretty soon that guy's got a lot of power, right? That's really what aristocracy is. And the king at the top of that's the same thing. I make all the aristocrats do what I want, and there's any given aristocrat's scared of the king. So they can get all the other aristocrats to squash that guy and take his stuff. So it's essentially force all the way down. But if you're at the bottom, which was most everyone, those people suddenly become very, very unequal. And this happens in tons of different societies in different ways. But it's not that dissimilar. Well, thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.